Hello and welcome to Ask Rob and Rob. Today is slightly different because we've only got one question, but it is a particularly good one. So let's have a listen to that now. Oh, hi, Rob and Rob. This is Bob from Londonderry. Rob D, I'm so excited about your book, The Price of Money, coming out in just a couple of days' time, but I can't possibly wait. Could you please read out some bits from the book on the show? Because I just need something to tide me over until my copy arrives. Thanks. Love the show. Well, thank you for that question, Bob. Happy to do so. So we'll do this as a very special Ask Rob and Rob. I've gone through my book, The Price of Money, which is coming out on Thursday, and picked out a few of my favourite little bits, and I'll read them out to you now to give you a flavour if you haven't ordered the book yet and you're trying to decide whether you want to, or if you just want a little bit of a sneak preview. So this is from chapter 4. We're talking about how money used to be backed by gold, but after World War II, that came to an end and a new system was put in place. In 1944, a new system was devised and signed up to by 44 countries. The new system had 3 defining characteristics. Firstly, the dollar was given a fixed value in terms of gold, 1 ounce to $35. Then every other currency fixed its exchange rate in relation to the dollar. And countries, but not individuals, could hand their dollars back to the US central bank, called the Federal Reserve, at any time and receive the equivalent amount of gold. This created a consistent and predictable basis for countries to trade with one another because everything was ultimately still based on gold. It established the dollar as a convenient, trusted currency that could be used for global trade. For example, the owners of a Japanese factory selling products to Greece might not want to receive drachmas in exchange for goods, but they'd be happy to receive dollars, knowing that they could use those dollars in another international trade. Alternatively, they could convert them back to their home currency, the yen, at a preset exchange rate. Under this system, currencies, including the pound, were effectively backed by gold, just as they had been in the past, but with the dollar sitting in the middle to facilitate. And it worked. Post-war stability was achieved, and global trade was rebuilt. For the system to continue functioning indefinitely, one thing was essential. Countries needed to believe that they would always be able to exchange dollars for a fixed amount of gold. In other words, they needed to believe that there really was enough gold to back up the dollars being issued. All the US government had to do, therefore, was avoid creating millions of extra dollars without first accumulating more gold to back it up. Not too much to ask in the scheme of things. Oh, it was too much to ask, but let's be honest, not completely unexpected. As we've already seen several times over, when leaders are given the power to create money and the full negative consequences will become some future leader's problem, it often proves impossible for them to resist. Under successive governments, the US ran massive social programs, fought a lengthy war in Vietnam, and raced Russia to the moon, which all required money the country didn't actually have, so could only be achieved by creating more dollars. When other countries realised what was going on, they started to lose faith that they'd be able to convert their dollars into gold in the future because there couldn't possibly be enough of it. The upshot? Many countries started exercising their right to hand back their dollars and demand gold. The US gold supply dwindled to the point where some kind of action was needed, and on the 15th of August 1971, President Nixon announced that the convertibility of the US dollar into gold would be temporarily suspended. In other words, on a temporary basis, $35 would stop equaling 1 ounce of gold, or any amount of gold. On a temporary basis, a US dollar would be backed by nothing, and therefore so would every other currency with its exchange rate tied to the dollar. That temporary basis has now been going on for 50 years and counting. If questioned, I imagine most people would have the vague notion that something is giving the value to the pound, the dollar, or any other national currency. Either because they remember a time when there was, or because it just seems logical that there must be. Yet, since that day in 1971, there isn't even the pretense that a currency is backed by anything tangible. In principle, this means there's nothing to prevent governments from creating as much of their own currency as they want to. And naturally, as they have throughout history, when the opportunity presents itself, they do. Okay, I'll now read out a little bit from chapter 7, where I'm talking about government borrowing and the national debt. Until recently, the interest payments on this £2.4 trillion debt was very low. In April 2020, the UK government was selling 10-year bonds at an interest rate of 0.375%. Not only was that minuscule, but it's also less than the rate of inflation, which means the government will probably end up paying the buyers of those bonds back with money that's worth less than the investors gave in the first place. The interest rate the government ends up paying is important because the biggest risk to the solvency of the nation isn't the absolute amount of debt, it's the cost of repayments on that debt. Over the last 50 years, although the amount of debt has been increasing relentlessly, the amount of interest that the government has to pay on it each year as a proportion of GDP has been falling. And that's largely because interest rates have been on a downward trajectory for decades. The UK has managed a far larger repayment burden in the past, and the current level of around 3% of GDP is low. But of course, it would still be better if we didn't have to pay it at all. Interest payments on the national debt currently cost the equivalent of what we spend on the police, court system and prisons put together. Over 90% of government revenue comes from taxes, so if it didn't need to pay out interest on its past borrowings, the government could reduce taxes or redirect them to spending that produces benefits today. There's also, of course, the problem that interest rates now aren't falling, but are rising. As we'll explore in a lot more detail later on, the cost of government borrowing started to increase sharply during 2022. In September 2022, 10-year bonds were being issued with an interest rate of more than 4%, having been less than 0.5% a couple of years earlier. This means that unless the increase in borrowing costs is a blip, and as we'll see, it's very likely not to be, the government will need to take out new debt at higher rates in the future to repay older debt that it had taken out on lower rates in the past. In the absence of significant GDP growth to compensate, this means that the debt interest will make up a larger share of GDP than it does now. It'll either absorb a larger share of tax revenues, using money that could be better spent on other things, or mean that taxes will need to be increased, which could affect the growth of the economy. This will become a problem gradually as cheaper debt expires over a number of years. Yet by 2022, governments were already seeing their interest costs rise because the repayments they must make on certain loans are linked to inflation. The UK is particularly exposed because 25% of its debt is index-linked in this way, compared to 8% in the US and less than 5% in Germany. As a result, in September 2022, the UK government's interest bill was 49% higher than it was a year earlier, even before it began facing the need to repay cheap debt with more expensive debt in earnest. This is the downside of habitually running a deficit, as governments have been doing since the 1970s. It's not a problem until it is. Most people have an intuitive sense that the government should be able to balance the books over time. They'd find it odd that the government should need to spend more than it receives, even during a normal year when there's no particular crisis. For decades, much mainstream economics has argued that this isn't an issue. You can simply grow your way out of it. Now those deficits have accumulated into a giant debt on which payments are rising fast, it suddenly feels a far more urgent issue. Really, this is the difference between borrowing to invest and borrowing to exist. If you told me that you'd just taken out a £20,000 loan to buy a house that you believe is going to appreciate in value, I'd be happy for you. If you told me that you'd just taken out a £20,000 loan to repay some of your previous debts and keep food on the table for the next year, I'd be worried about you. Similarly, if the government borrowed £23 billion in a particular year to upgrade broadband across the country, with the intention that it'll unlock more than £23 billion worth of productivity gains over the next 10 years, you may or may not agree with the scheme, but at least you can see the logic. If it borrowed £23 billion just to pay for the everyday services the country needs, and will need to borrow another £23 billion next year just to keep the lights on, that's more worrying. And that is exactly what's happening. £23 billion was the amount of new borrowing the government took on in the year up to March 2019, which I've chosen because it was before any COVID-related borrowing was part of the picture. Most of it not to invest in any productivity-boosting new infrastructure, but just to keep the exchequer ticking over. Okay, I'll just do a couple more little snippets. So this is from chapter 9, I think, where I'm talking about COVID and the response to COVID and all the money printing that happened as a result. So earlier in the book, I talked about money printing as it happened in 2008 in response to that crisis. And in this chapter, I've come on to talk about how it was used in a different way in 2020. Let's use the Bank of England as an example, although the mechanism was largely the same everywhere. It worked like this. Firstly, the Bank of England created new money, which it used to buy up government bonds from financial institutions, just as it did after the 2008 crisis. At the same time, the Treasury issued new bonds, exactly the same amount that the Bank of England was buying. The result? the government was guaranteed to have buyers for its new bonds, because the Bank of England was simultaneously removing exactly the same amount of bonds from the market. Effectively, the government was guaranteeing that there was demand for its new bonds by having the Bank of England take away, using newly created money, the bonds people already owned. It's a bit like my creating guaranteed demand for this book by continually taking it away from you and giving you the money to replace it with a new copy I'd just printed. I should point out that officially, the Bank of England denies that the aim of 2020 QE was to directly finance government spending. Indeed, its webpage on QE was edited in November 2021 to add the question, does quantitative easing help to pay for government spending? And the accompanying answer, that's not why we do QE. We do it to keep inflation low and stable and support the economy. Clearly just a coincidence, then, that the £450 billion worth of QE announced in 2020 matched the government's sudden new cash requirements almost exactly. And even more of a coincidence that the month-by-month timing of QE exactly matched the government's cash needs, as Chart 22, which I know you can't see here, shows. To understand the pace and magnitude of the QE that took place in the UK in 2020, we can look at the money supply. The money supply had already been growing as a result of previous rounds of QE, but the £450 billion worth of QE that took place in 2020 alone was more than the entire previous total up to that point. Indeed, when you look at Chart 23, which again you can't see, showing the growth in base money over the last 10 years, you can see a near vertical line over the year from 2020 to 2021. The previous time that the Bank of England had gone on a QE bender, the money just washed around the financial system and didn't have much of an effect on consumer prices. But this time, things were different. Now, governments were issuing new bonds that were being bought in a convoluted way by the central banks, and governments were taking the money they received and putting it directly into people's pockets. In the US, this took the form of stimulus checks and unemployment benefits, and in the UK, it was the furlough scheme. But the result was the same. The newly created money ended up being spent on goods and services in the real economy rather than trapped in the financial system. Indeed, the entire point of dishing out the money was that it would be spent. As a result, it had the potential to be far more inflationary in terms of consumer prices than before. And was it? Well, yes, as Chart 24 shows. After more than a decade of flatlining, the official measure of inflation surged towards double digits and beyond. There were, to be fair, various forces driving inflation in this period, beyond simply QE. For about a year after inflation started to tick up in 2021, the heads of the major central banks tried to push the line that inflation was transitory. Nothing to do with us, was the claim. Higher prices were the result of the pandemic itself, not the response. Supply chains had been disrupted, productive capacity had fallen, and there was a sudden boom in demand as large parts of the world started to open up again. This would all sort itself out soon enough, and prices would stop increasing, thus transitory. Conveniently, this interpretation meant there was no need for them to do anything about it. And they didn't. I then go on to talk about what central banks did eventually do and the effects that's had. And then there's chapter 10, which is probably the most important, where I talk about what's likely to happen in the future, how you would invest to take advantage of that state of affairs, and how I'm personally investing to try to take advantage and avoid being harmed by some of the things I believe are going to happen. But I'm going to skip over that and go to the conclusion and just read out a little snippet from that. As this book has shown, the history of money has seen different eras come and go, where some kind of crisis triggers a shift of the financial world from one system to another. For example, 80 years ago, we moved from a backed by gold system to a linked to the dollar system. Then 50 years ago, we moved from that to a fiat system, meaning that money only has value because the government says so. When you're living within any of these eras, it feels natural and normal because that's what we're used to. But every system of money is a human construct, and history tells us that they all blow up messily in the end. I then go on to talk about last year's mini budget and what happened in the aftermath of that, and then move on to this section. As well as being about as close as economics comes to high-octane drama, for me, the whole Sorry episode was a trailer for how everything eventually ends. The global markets are based on confidence. It's totally fine for governments and everyone else to be massively indebted, as long as there's a general belief that it'll all be okay. When confidence evaporates, in much the same way as the world's major banks lost confidence in one another in 2007, it can do so very quickly. And when that happens, because there's so much leverage in the system, things can break in unexpected areas where the consequences hadn't been foreseen. Remember, all that happened in late 2022 was that the government announced its plans for some extra borrowing. As a result, via a long and complex chain of events, the entire UK pension system nearly collapsed. If the Bank of England hadn't been able to step in and prevent that from happening, it would have been an event large enough to potentially bring down the whole global financial system. It's no longer the backing of a precious metal that keeps the global economy afloat. It's confidence. And when that confidence is shaken, extreme and seemingly improbable things can happen faster than anyone expected. So when will that confidence finally evaporate and unleash a chain of consequences that can't be contained? At one point, it looked as though 2008 could be the point at which governments and their central banks ran out of tools to keep the system propped up. The world then went into the 2020 crisis in an even more vulnerable position, and it looked as if that could be the end. Then there was the dramatic turbulence of late 2022. Will the point at which they finally run out of road be the next crisis, or the one after that, or the one after that? It's impossible to know. But we do know that eventually there will come a point when faith in our debt-ridden economies is lost. Once that happens, our current era of money will end and a new one will begin. What will that new era look like? Will the transition be relatively painless or involve major social upheaval? Who will win from it and who will lose? Those are impossible questions to answer. All we know is that it will happen eventually, because history tells us it always does. So those are some snippets from The Price of Money. I hope that gave you a little taste of what's in the book. That obviously is just a tiny, tiny amount. There's so much more packed in there. It's being released this Thursday, the 30th of March, as a hardback, on Kindle, and as an audiobook. If you've pre-ordered those, it'll be landing with you on Thursday. If you haven't pre-ordered yet, but you do want to get the book, definitely a good idea to get it before Thursday, because I have got pre-order bonuses for you, which are going to go away as soon as the book is released. So if you do pre-order the book on any format, then you'll get a free 90-minute video course where I talk you through some of the key themes from the book. So it'll just help you solidify some of those lessons. I can explain some of it visually as well. Also, I'll mention while I think of it that if you order the audiobook, you do get a PDF with all the charts, so you can refer to those. But I want to encourage hardback purchases because that's what counts for the bestseller lists. Backwards as it sounds, it's true. That's the one that counts as far as the charts are concerned. So if you pre-order the hardback version specifically, then you can also attend the Wealth Sessions, which is a series of online events I'm putting together at lunchtimes throughout May, where I'll be talking to some of the finest minds in the world about money and how you can make the most of it in the future. There are currently 6 of those sessions confirmed, including William Green, who's a writer for The New Yorker and the best-selling author of one of my favourite books, Richer, Wiser, Happier. There's also Andrew Craig, who's the author of How to Own the World, which is a really popular book in the UK. There's Claire Barrett from the Financial Times. There is Jeff Booth, who's probably one of the top 5 most influential people in the world when it comes to Bitcoin. And Akhil Patel, who is probably one of the 2 or 3 people in the world who know more than anyone else about the 18-year property cycle. So those are going to be amazing conversations. You can join those live and actually put your questions to me and those experts. So that's a little extra reward for pre-ordering the hardback version. To order any of those formats, just go to pricesofmoney.co.uk. That's where you'll find links to Amazon, Waterstones, whatever else you want to buy. And you can claim your bonuses there as well. So that's pricesofmoney.co.uk. So, Bob, I hope that answers your question. Everyone else, I hope that you enjoyed that as well. And we'll see you back here on Thursday for another and very special episode of the Property Podcast. Have a good week. Bye-bye.